of this panel is Dr. Elizabeth Lizzie English, PhD student at the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. Hi, Lizzie. How's it going? Is everything fine?
Hi, yes, all good. Thank you very much for inviting us to this session. It's great to be here.
You're welcome. It's such a pleasure. So I think you can share your screen. I stop sharing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great. Can you see that? Amazing. I'm going to presume that you can all see that okay. Yes, wonderful. So I'll just give a little introduction to the session, if that's all right. I hope you're all enjoying the symposium so far. Yeah, fantastic. Great. So I'd like to thank the event organisers for inviting us to arrange this session for this fantastic international symposium. So before I get into the talks, I'll briefly introduce myself. So thank you, Helen, as well, for introducing me. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge and the founder of Women in Neuroscience UK. So I'll tell you a little bit about Women in Neuroscience UK first. So our mission is to connect and inspire females interested in neuroscience from across the UK and invite people of all genders to discuss the issues with gender bias in our workplaces and in our research topics as well. So I've built this website and our social media from scratch, but I now also have a growing team along with me. So these are female neuroscientists at a variety of career stages from across the UK. And they're helping me to kickstart all of our virtual content. So I'd like to thank especially the events team today for their support with organising this event. And we also have sub-teams, so our social media sub-team and our blogs sub-team who are working behind the scenes on lots of great content as well. So you can find out more about Women in Neuroscience UK via our website, and you can access this via this link or by scanning this QR code with your phone here. And you can also keep up to date with us via our mailing list, which is available on the website, or by following us on social media at womeninneuro_UK. And we'd love to continue discussions that we'll be having in this session via social media too. So you can hashtag Women in Neuro, or you can visit our gender equity chat on our website. So now moving on to our session for today, I'm very pleased to introduce it, and this is entitled Gender Disparities Across Neurological Conditions. So I'll tell you a little bit about it now. So gender bias continues to impact the success and the satisfaction of neuroscience researchers, the usefulness of neuroscientific trials, and also the experiences of those with neurological conditions. The topics for our session are going to span gender disparities in neurodevelopment, brain injury, and also neurodegeneration. The session will be approximately 90 minutes long, and it's going to include 3 different talks, each with 5 minutes afterwards for questions. And then the session will conclude with a group Q&A discussion involving all of our speakers together. So if you're in the audience, you're very welcome to put questions in the chat throughout the session. These can be directed to specific speakers, or they can be more general questions on women in neuroscience for us all to answer as well. And during the Q&A sessions, either directly after the talks or at the end with all of us together, you can also unmute to ask questions too if you would like to ask them directly. And we really do hope that our talks and discussions are going to provide you with insights into new research that supports the experiences of gender disparities in neuroscience, and maybe even highlight practical changes that we can implement to improve these disparities. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. I'm going to be joined by a panel of experts here today, and I'll introduce you to them all first, and then we'll get started with the talks. So firstly, we're going to have Victoria Milner from King's College London, and she'll be presenting her research into the experiences of autistic women and girls and the barriers facing their diagnoses. Our second talk will be from Katherine Snedaker and Hope Kent, and they're going to be discussing sex and gender differences in brain injury. Both of these speakers represent PINK Concussions. This is the only charity that focuses on brain injury in women and girls, and this involves sport, domestic violence, accidents, and military service. And Katherine is the executive director and founder of this charity, whilst Hope is the UK EU policy and research director. Hope can also be found researching brain injury at the University of Exeter. And our final talk today will be given by Katherine Hanlon from Research Impact and Strategy at Alzheimer's Research UK. And Katherine is going to be discussing the process and findings of Alzheimer's Research UK's analysis into gender and dementia, and how these findings are inspiring new ways to evaluate the research in this field. She'll also touch on potential reasons for the higher prevalence of dementia in women. So I'm very excited by this whole range of talks within neurological conditions in the lens of gender disparities. So I'm very excited to get started. And finally, I would like to introduce my co-chair for today, and she's from the events team at Women in Neuroscience UK, and she's a neuroscience undergraduate student as well at Cardiff University. So Shloka, please could you introduce yourself and also introduce our first speaker?
Thank you, Lizzie, for the wonderful introduction. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm Shloka, and I'm an undergraduate student in neuroscience at Cardiff University, UK. It is my absolute pleasure to be introducing our first speaker for today. She is Victoria, and she is a PhD student at King's College London, and she's going to be talking to us about barriers to autism diagnosis for autistic women and girls. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'll just do the awkward bit of sharing my screen, just a moment. Okay, perfect. Can you see the slides? Yeah, perfect. Great. So thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm very excited to be part of this symposium today. As I've mentioned, I'm Victoria Milner. I've just submitted my PhD thesis, and the topic was on barriers to autism diagnosis for women and girls. And today I'm going to focus just on one of the potential hypotheses as to why there is a gender disparity in autism. Before I go into some of the background and some of my research, I just wanted to give an overview about what autism is, as I'm aware we have a diverse range of researchers in the audience. So autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition. And in the most recent edition of the diagnostic manual, there are two criteria that need to be met. The first is difficulties with social interaction and communication. And the second is restricted and repetitive behaviors, activities, and/or interests. And these are quite broad categories or broad criteria. And it's important to remember that within those, there are different behavioral manifestations there. So for example, within the first criteria, it might be difficulties navigating social relationships, building friendships, maintaining those friendships. It could be difficulties with verbal or non-verbal cues or social prompts. And within restricted and repetitive behaviors, it might be intense prolonged interest in one particular area. It could be stimming behavior. It could be a wide range of lots of different things to a different extent within different contexts, which is why you might have heard of the phrase autism spectrum as well. There's currently no biological or sort of neurological test for autism. So diagnoses are given based on behavioral observation and clinical information as well. And 1% of the world population have a diagnosis of autism. However, historically, autism has been perceived as a male disorder. And this is both within the general society. So for example, when you see autism presented in the media or in pop culture, it's often a male character. But also in terms of people who are often involved in identifying autism, so teachers, there's evidence to show that when given a vignette about a student presenting with autistic characteristics, if the teacher is told that the character in the vignette is male, they're more likely to perceive that child as autistic compared to when told the child is female. There's also evidence, or historically, there were thought to be 10 males given a diagnosis for every one female given a diagnosis, with an average being about 4 to 5. However, more recent evidence tells us that the more realistic ratio is about 3 males to 1 female receiving an autism diagnosis. So this shows that women have been under-recognized or overlooked in terms of giving an autism diagnosis, and there might have been lots and lots of women who haven't received support because of this as well. We also know that on average, females are diagnosed later than males. And we know that females are less likely to receive a diagnosis than males, despite having similar levels of autistic traits, despite having the same number of assessment appointments for clinicians or diagnosticians, and despite this similar age of first concern from parents or from caregivers as well. And so the one hypothesis that I want to think about today and discuss in a bit more detail today is the camouflaging hypothesis. And this is the concept that females are less likely to obtain an autism diagnosis or may obtain an autism diagnosis later than their male peers due to the use of strategies that disguise or mask their autistic characteristics. So firstly, what is camouflaging? So camouflaging is a word that's used in sort of general vocabulary, but in this context, what we mean is the use of strategies that mask, minimize, or compensate for autistic characteristics. So to give a few examples, I've separated those into the two diagnostic criteria. So some examples based on social communication and interaction differences, a person might approximate eye contact. And by that, I mean look at the bridge of a person's nose rather than directly in person's eyes whilst communicating with them. They may mimic the characteristics of another person who they deem to be socially successful. And this could include both the behaviors or the interests of that person, how they dress, how they speak. It could be lots of different ways. It could also be rehearsing scripts or social prompts before engaging in a social interaction. When thinking about restricted and repetitive behaviors, activities, or interests, some camouflaging strategies include suppressing repetitive behaviors or stimming behaviors, or it could be avoiding conversations about particular interests in social settings as well. And these are just very few examples. There's lots and lots of different ways in which camouflaging might present itself. And these strategies could both be unconscious or conscious strategies, and they might vary depending on the context and the people involved in that context as well. But as I mentioned earlier, there's this hypothesis that females are less likely to obtain a diagnosis due to using these strategies. And it might be that females are diagnosed later than males, as it's not until social demands outweigh their ability to camouflage. So for example, when a girl goes into adolescence and the social interactions become more complex and more nuanced, those social demands might outweigh the person's ability to camouflage or to mask their differences, and therefore they might be at that age identified as needing a diagnosis or as needing additional support as well. So this is important both in terms of thinking about whether camouflaging impacts recognition of autism to start with, but also within the diagnostic process and the consequences as well after receiving a diagnosis. There are many qualitative accounts, so sort of interview studies, diary accounts from autistic women themselves, discussing pretending to be normal or adopting masking, camouflaging, and the impact that's had on them. And I don't have time to go into that in a lot of detail today, but I do really urge you to read those studies, as it's really important to center the voices of autistic women and autistic people as well when considering these types of presentations. However, there's also some quantitative evidence that women do camouflage more than men. And I'm just going to discuss two of the studies that were part of my PhD very briefly now. So in the first study, we wanted to look to see whether there is a relationship between camouflaging and the age at which a person obtains an autism diagnosis, with the idea that if someone is engaging in camouflaging strategies, they're likely to be diagnosed later. And we wanted to see whether this relationship was different for autistic women and autistic men. So we looked at this in two different samples. The first was a population community-based sample, which included 24 autistic men and 35 autistic women. And these were aged between 20 and 24. And the second sample was an online survey sample, which was a lot larger, of 242 autistic men and 570 autistic women, aged 18 to 75, so quite a good age range there. And what we did is we used a self-report measure of camouflaging. So it's called the Camouflaging Autistic Traits Questionnaire, or the CATQ, and it's a 25-item measure which asks the participant to indicate to what extent they use a list of 25 different camouflaging strategies. And what we found from this study was, as we expected and supporting existing literature, the women in our samples, in both samples, were diagnosed later than men. And this remained to be true when controlling for current age and for the level of autistic traits. We also found that there was a stronger positive relationship between self-reported camouflaging and later age diagnosis for autistic women in the sample. So it could be that camouflaging is influencing the age of diagnosis more so for autistic women than for autistic men in this sample. However, the findings were tentative, with some of the sort of significant being marginal. And one of the limitations of the study was that we only used self-report measures of camouflaging. And there is an argument that if we only use self-report measures of camouflaging, we might just be capturing the sort of intent to camouflage and not necessarily how effective those strategies are in masking or disguising those autistic traits and characteristics. So in the second study, I'm going to briefly discuss, we wanted to compare these different types of camouflage or different measures of camouflaging at least. So we compared measures of camouflaging intent and camouflaging effectiveness in males and females, both with and without an autism diagnosis. So these two groups of participants, they had the same or similar levels of autistic traits, but one group had a diagnosis and one group didn't have a diagnosis of autism. And we think this is important to avoid the sort of circularity. If we're saying that women are less likely to get a diagnosis due to camouflaging, then it seems a bit circular to only include those with a diagnosis in our samples. So we thought it was important then to include both those with and with a diagnosis. So as you can see, we had 46 diagnosed males and 40 diagnosed females, 45 high trait males and 43 high trait females. And again, we had a self-report measure of camouflaging, but then we also measured theory of mind, which is a cognitive ability to understand another person's point of view. And theory of mind or deficits in theory of mind or impairments have been associated with autistic social difficulties as well. And we also measured self-reported autistic traits. Again, that was a questionnaire. And I've missed this one off, but we also measured observed autistic traits. So that was a trained person that implemented a gold standard assessment of autism in this study. And then the three measures of camouflaging we had then was this self-reported measure that I've mentioned, but also these two discrepancy scores with the idea that these were capturing the effectiveness of the camouflaging rather than just the intent. So the first discrepancy score was a difference between theory of mind and observed autistic traits. And the second discrepancy score was the difference between self-reported autistic traits and the observed autistic traits, with the idea that if the score of how autistic a person feels or reports themselves to be, or the cognitive difficulties they might be having are greater than the observed traits, then it might be that these traits aren't being observed because that person is camouflaging as well. So what we found was that in the diagnosed group, the women had significantly higher scores than the men across all three measures. So that's looking then at the blue line and the dark green line being the females, across the CAQ, which is a self-report measure, the Camo theory of mind measure, and the Camo SRS, which is the self-reported measure. Females scored higher across all of those. Interestingly, though, we also found that within the high trait group, so that's the dark pink and the orange lines, we found that both for males and females in the measures of effectiveness, they scored higher than the diagnosed participants. So this could indicate that for autistic people, regardless of their gender, if they're camouflaging, they're less likely to receive a diagnosis if that camouflaging is effective. But the intent to which the camouflaging might not tell us that much about whether that's a barrier to diagnosis for those people. Oh, yeah, no. But then thinking more about within that diagnosed group, then why are the females camouflaging more than the males? And there are a few different explanations. One is that potentially it's due to gendered norms or gendered expectations, with the idea that females tend to be expected to be more sociable or more sociable than males. And it could be that after receiving a diagnosis, perhaps this is completely hypothetical, males might feel they have more permission once they have that label, due to there being a greater understanding of autism within males to be themselves. Whereas for women, as there's less understanding of autism in women, it might be that they still feel the need to adopt these strategies and camouflaging strategies in order to fit in and to be accepted as well. Another possibility is that the longer diagnostic process that we know that women experience might lead to greater introspection and greater awareness of the strategies that they're using. And it might give them greater opportunities to sort of implement those strategies and to tailor those strategies to have greater effectiveness as well. I just want to emphasize why this is important to understand as well. So it's beyond just getting a diagnosis of autism, but to understand camouflaging as well is important to think about the consequences or the outcomes associated with engaging in these strategies. So we found that overall, the women, particularly the diagnosed women, camouflage more than autistic males. And this quote here was recently added to the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition. And it says that many adults report using compensation strategies and coping mechanisms to mask their difficulties in public, but suffer from the stress and effort of maintaining a socially acceptable facade. So I think it's really important for us to consider going forward what the outcomes are associated with camouflaging. And from the work of the autistic women and the qualitative accounts that I mentioned earlier, we know that it's potentially associated with poorer quality of life, poorer mental well-being and exhaustion as well. So it's really important that we consider this as well. So some implications that I'm focusing on working with colleagues as well, based on these findings, is to improve the overall awareness and understanding of camouflaging and autism in females for all stakeholders. So that's for parents and for teachers who are likely to be the first people to identify possible challenges, but also for anyone involved in the diagnostic process as well, and for subsequent support. And also we're working on developing tools and guidance to help clinicians perhaps identify these camouflaging strategies within the diagnostic process. As it's such a short assessment period, it could be that a person might be engaging in these strategies within that assessment. So it's really important for us to think about how we can investigate that further as well. So my take-home messages then, I think just gone slightly over time, sorry, is that women and girls have historically been overlooked and under-recognized in autism research and in diagnostic practices, and that autistic women on average camouflage to a greater extent and more effectively than autistic men, which potentially impacts the access to diagnosis and timely support. Finally, thank you to my participants, my supervisors, my lab group, my funders, and to you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for the very intriguing talk. I'm going to ask you a question while the audience can put their questions in the chat now. So my question to you, Victoria, is there a notable difference between the autism severity between genders?
I think that's a really good question. So the short answer is no. So people from any gender can experience autism with any different level of support needs or any different levels of functioning. So they can across the whole spectrum. However, there is some evidence that on some measures, females might come across as more severe. But there is a suggestion that this might be due to the sort of milder presentations and milder manifestations of autism for women and for girls might not be identified as easily or picked up as easily from clinicians, etc. Therefore, they're not receiving these diagnoses with those women and girls with fewer support needs or fewer challenges as well. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Seeing there are no questions in the chat. Wait, oh my God, there's one. Do you think men or women seek a diagnosis at different rates? Is stigma preventing women from seeking assessment? That's a question.
That's a really good question as well. I think that so historically it's been perceived as a male disorder. So often, if we're thinking about children, parents might not flag up those different difficulties as autism for girls as much as men. So I think that boys would be more likely to go for a diagnosis. More recently, it's becoming more in adult services. A lot more adults are going forward for a diagnosis, and a lot of these people tend to be females or not males, at least. I think there was evidence that showed there was like a 787% increase or something like that in the amount of people receiving a diagnosis across the past 2 decades. And that was mostly driven by females and by people getting a diagnosis in adulthood as well. So there's definitely an increase in more recent years for women going to get a diagnosis. I think the stigma part of that question is really important, because there is this also idea that camouflaging is driven by stigma. So the idea that if you camouflage, you're less likely to receive negative perceptions and negative stereotypes from other people as well. So I think stigma definitely plays a key role in accessing a diagnosis as well.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Hope, for the question as well. We have 2 more questions. First question is from Katherine. Does it matter if the person doing the assessment is male or female?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the sort of scientific answer for that. I don't know if there's any evidence that's actually looked at the gender of the clinician doing the assessment. I think it's probably more to do with the sort of level of experience and the level of training that clinician has, rather than the gender of the clinician. But it would be a really interesting topic to look at further and to do some more research on, because I don't know the definite answer for that.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions. This question is from Lan. Thank you, Lan. How to
Oh, sorry, I think the internet cut out a bit there, but I think I can see the question in the chat. So
okay, yeah,
I'll read that. So there is an argument that everybody camouflages at some point throughout their lives. So, for example, today I'm speaking in a different manner or modulating my behavior and my language compared to if I was out for dinner with my friends, for example. The difference with autistic camouflaging and sort of impression management or camouflaging in the general population is to do with, firstly, the motivations as to why a person might do that. As I mentioned briefly about stigma, but also in terms of other people's perceptions and a mismatch between the social context and that person's ability to intuitively understand that context. It's also to do with the cognitive processes that are involved in engaging in those strategies. So for an autistic person who might have difficulties with executive functioning or with sort of social cognition, it exerts a lot more energy and a lot more cognitive energy than just composing yourself as a non-autistic person. And then also the outcomes associated with camouflaging or composing yourself as well. For an autistic person, it's likely that it has a greater impact on, I guess, a more of a negative impact to some people in terms of exhaustion, poor mental health, poor quality of life. And also there's been reports about feeling inauthentic and not feeling the authentic self when engaging in these strategies. Whereas for a person engaging in impression management or composing yourself, it might be that because you're not using those strategies as much or in as many contexts, it has less of an impact on how you feel as your authentic self. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. I think Shloka's frozen, bless her. So we'll move on. Irma, do you have a final question? That would
exactly.
Victoria.
Yes, thank you.
I see Irma in addition. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Thank you for a nice presentation. And about the theory on mind, yeah. Why do you choose this for measurement? And do you find any differences between genders? And a question regarding the ADHD. What type of experience do you have regarding this? Because it's also the same issue sometimes too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So the first one about why did we use theory of mind? So we just wanted to get a sort of, I guess, a proxy measure of a underlying cognitive difficulty that many autistic people experience. And there's evidence that for autistic people, theory of mind is often, they have poorer theory of mind than non-autistic people. So we use that as the measure. As far as I'm aware, there's not evidence that there are gender differences in theory of mind ability across for autistic people and non-autistic people. So that's why we use that as a measure. I do think going forward, we need to have a more, we need to use not just one sort of cognitive proxy. We need to look at other things that might capture camouflaging. But that was why we used it And also from a more practical side of things, we already had that data collected. So that's why it was quite straightforward for us to use that. In terms of ADHD as well, I don't know much about ADHD, so I'm hesitant to sort of comment too much, but I am aware that there are this gender disparity as well for diagnosis with an ADHD. And one of my more recent projects, I was working with a group of students in a secondary school who had a range of different neurodivergent conditions. And what they did is they came up with a measure that was similar to the camouflaging autistic traits measure, but it was looking at camouflaging ADHD traits, or ADHD characteristic measure as well. And this group of students came up with that themselves, and we conducted a survey within the school. So we're still in the sort of stages of seeing whether it's sort of psychometrically sound and what the outcomes of that are. But I definitely think that from speaking to other neurodivergent students and participants as well, that these strategies are likely to be engaged, from other people with ADHD and similar things.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Victoria, for the great talk and great answers to the questions as well. We'll move on now to our next talk. So this is from Hope Kent and Katherine Snedaker. Please do go ahead and share your presentation.
How does that look? I'm turning off.
Good, Katherine.
Closed captions. All right. Hello. Just a financial disclosure that myself and Hope have no financial or non-financial interest to disclose.
So we're here with PINK Concussions, which is an organisation that was founded by Katherine in the US, and she's been a really inspirational brain injury advocate for the last 10 years. And more recently, Mary Laflague in Canada and myself in the UK have come on board to try and extend the reach of PINK's advocacy.
What is PINK Concussions? So we are a nonprofit formed in 2015, and we advocate for better research in the research community. We research TBI differences ourselves. We do trainings for the medical community through international conferences. One coming up in New York in September, if anyone wants information on that. We create online resources for professionals through our YouTube channel, and we moderate support groups. We have about 8,000 women and professionals in our support groups currently on Facebook. PINK Concussions is a blend of research from sports, from accidents, from domestic violence and gender-based violence, and military TBI research. And all those together form the breaking down of the silos together to form the research on brain injury in women. Just a quick review for brain injury. Traumatic brain injury, the causes are listed on the left and non-traumatic on the right. So falls, assaults, motor vehicle accidents, sports, gunshot, child abuse is a traumatic brain injury, while seizures, electric shocks, tumors, metabolic disorders would be non-traumatic brain injury. Also, the term mild TBI, MTBI, and concussion, there are many different definitions depending on what organization, what view one's taking of it, but in general, those are similar words. And then after 1 month, it was formerly called post-concussion syndrome. It's now called persistent post-concussion symptoms. And the thing to remember about that is you want to end with symptoms, you don't want to end with the word syndrome. And that is discussion of the physical symptoms, the sensory symptoms, and the cognitive symptoms, like headache, ringing in the ears, mood changes.
So more moderate or severe TBI comes about when a loss of consciousness after the head injury lasts from several minutes to hours or days, so it lasts longer than for a mild TBI, and also comes about when there are lots of repeated head injuries that can multiply in severity. The sequelae and symptoms are often much more severe, sometimes with physical disability, and more severe sensory and cognitive disturbances too. ultimately, the effects of a brain injury are going to vary based on how severe the injury was and which part of the brain was injured. So that means that diagnosis and management has to be really quite unique for that person's individual injury and the symptom presentation that they get. So this image shows a few ways that a TBI might impact somebody's life, but that's by no means exhaustive.
So I started out as a social worker working with trauma and PTSD at the VA, and then later in a children's organization, had 3 children, and then became a youth sports coach. And in that process, my son had a number of concussions, and I started shifting my work to supporting families with concussions. By 2012, I was working with children that had teenagers that had post-concussion syndrome. At the time it was called, now it's called post the symptoms, and it turned out to be mostly girls. And by the time I started running support groups, it was all girls. So in that process, I started looking at the research. Why were these girls having such a difficult time? And that their coaches and parents and teachers were really looking at them as sort of faking an illness. And you know, a teenage girl doesn't want to stay home alone and not be with her friends. So I started looking at the research. In the middle of doing all this and putting up the first PINK concussion site, I got cancer, which I hadn't really planned on. I had been focusing on my own concussions and my child's, and suddenly I was thrust into a different field. I wasn't interested in cancer, but suddenly I had cancer. And what I learned is there was such sympathy. I had gotten a divorce a couple of years earlier. I'd gotten one casserole, which is like a hot plate, and Hurricane Sandy had wrecked my house, and I had a little bit, and then concussions, nobody helped us at all. But then suddenly I had breast cancer. I was still working out at the gym, but I was getting fed every night. So there seemed to be this social understanding of how to care for a family with breast cancer, where it didn't relate to brain injury. So that was very interesting to me. And through that, I had a lot of time to research, talk to people, and put up a website. At 2014, I had survived cancer, so you kind of get to do anything you want for a little bit. And I ran around to concussion conferences, and I walked up to researchers. I attended 14 conferences, and I went and I said, why aren't women in your research? So many of the research papers I had looked at had no women included at all. And then I said, why aren't you reporting the results by males and females? If women were included in the initial research, the results were only listed as people.
So we're going to frame our discussions in this presentation by differences resulting from sex and gender. We're giving you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what these differences are and why they matter, but hopefully there's more time for discussions and things later as well. So we define sex here as the biological differences between males and females, and for us in brain injury that includes genetic, hormonal and physiological differences. We define gender as a social construct based upon sort of interpersonal roles and personal identification, and we recognise that this is often but not always concordant with biological sex, and challenges for women emerge from both sex and gender-based differences. So a woman's experience of brain injury will be defined by both her biology and the gendered response of the world around her. So we're going to frame the problem here in sports research because that's where a lot of these differences started to emerge for the first time. So research from 1999 onwards has illustrated quite consistently that female athletes are sustaining more concussions at a higher rate than their male counterparts. They're reporting a higher number and more severe symptoms than their male counterparts, and they also have longer recovery periods than males.
This was summarized in 2012 by the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine in a position paper. So at this point, 2012 was pretty understood enough that this whole group got together, and you know how it's hard to get a group of people to agree on anything. This was agreed upon, yet still it was not translated into protocols for women, education for parents, better medical support for female athletes. It just kind of was like stuck on the wall somewhere. So what's important to understand is that the reason it was seen because sports with similar rules where the amount of risk is similar. They're playing the same sport. The female athletes sustain more concussions than their male counterparts. We know in general, males take more risks in life and have more brain injury, but when sport was brought the range of risk equal. And at that point, it was determined, we see this, but is it sex differences? Is it gender differences? And what explained the rate of concussion at the time was people, researchers and sports people would say, well, women are more likely to report. And that's represented a lot in the research, especially in intro sections of papers, but it's never footnoted. So being the little scientist I am, I went back and looked and looked and looked. If you go back about 15 years, you can start to see where that came from. And it actually comes from cardiac research, where women are more articulate about describing their pain, not that they generally report more. So it was a misnomer there. And then women are less motivated to return to sport. That's been said by some of the top researchers in the sports concussion world, that women don't have professional careers. So they're probably, reporting more because they have less to lose. And then there's, oh, it's head to neck ratio. And then people threw it off. And women are not going to want to strengthen their neck. Women are not going to want thicker necks. No one wants a giant bulky neck. So even if that's true, I haven't seen a sports team more than a couple of weeks work on that. So what's the answer? Research has supported this since that initial statement in 2012, that the worst prognosis, more post-concussive symptoms following motor vehicle accident, and gender differences. So we're going to first talk about the sex differences that have been found. The sex differences are varied. There's the rate of brain injury between male and female. There's the symptom constellation, what type of symptoms. Women tend to have more symptoms than men. The extended recovery period, which could be gender, but right now we're thinking it's sex, brain structure, menstrual and endocrine dysfunction, and long-term fertility. So this is a picture that I grew up with, being 55, of the smoking lung. This is your lung not smoking. This is your lung smoking. It was really powerful. And I was waiting for the image to come out where we could just not say, well, we don't know why women are different. Maybe they're just the weaker sex or some sexist thing. I wanted the actual picture. So it was this study in 2018. Douglas Smith headed up on the physical differences in TBI, and they looked at axons in rodents, but I'm showing you humans because we know that rodents don't always translate, but this translated. So this is the axon. This is the nerve cell in the brain and sliced in half. And you can see these black neurotubulars. I'll show you this. It's kind of like a long tube. And what we're seeing here is that cross section. There are fewer nanotubulars in the female axon than in the male, and they're more slender. So when a blow or trauma happens, that nanotubular is more vulnerable. It twists and breaks. So there's more breakage, and then there's a calcium, potassium floodgate that happens, and it kind of makes a toxic soup. So it's more breakage, more toxic soup. And the way Doug describes it is it pushes the female axons towards degeneration and dysfunction rather than recovery. Another chemical difference is the endocrine disorders after TBI. Well, we know that there are a number of disorders that happen in people. We know that after TBI that these endocrine disorders happen in 15 to 60% of adults and 42% of children. But in looking at that, we don't understand the sex differences. So this is a great study Bruce Ortez did, and we have a video where I interview and he talks more about this study on our YouTube channel if you're interested. But what they found out was that female adolescents were 64% more likely to have a pediatric endocrine disorder after TBI than male. We always encourage women to see a gynecologist, to work with endocrinologists. The number one post on our support groups for women is, did your period change after your TBI?
So, yeah, so moving on to some gendered or social differences in outcomes. gender differences in outcomes sort of exist because of a variety of reasons. So historically, research has been male funded and male focused, with differences for men and women not really being considered. Women have different social vulnerabilities, different access to high quality care, and often might be victims of gender-based violence and abuse, which can then lead to a brain injury, which then is less likely to be reported. Mechanisms of injury can also be different. So like in workplace injuries, men have historically been injured in manual jobs, where women might be injured in care settings through assaults and things for people that they're supporting. So they're quite different mechanisms. But essentially lots of concussion research has been viewed and inspired from a masculine perspective. In the UK, for example, our research in the 1990s was sort of inspired by sports like boxing and football, which were very male sports at the time. For example, John Koselis published this really seminal paper in 1973 about neuropathology in boxers. In the US, which is obviously a powerhouse of medical research and funding, American football has led the way in brain injury research, as per this quote from Dr. Schneider in 1967. Male researchers sort of studied male athletes playing male sports because that's where the funding and the public interest was.
And then in the laboratory, men were making the decisions, and it's not a menstrual cycle in rodents, it's an estrous cycle, but the menstrual cycle essentially of the female animals affected the results. So rather than seeing a biological variability there, it was seen as a roadblock. So they threw out the female animals and just used male in research.
Women are also vulnerable to different social outcomes following brain injury. So examples of this include high rates of poverty and social isolation following a brain injury, more difficulties with family support, with transportation, and with the provision of community resources that are specific for women. They also have different vocational outcomes as well. So traditionally feminine roles to fulfill, including like child rearing and household management, which are often non-negotiable. So for example, for a single mother, and these need to be really viable rehabilitation goals, which often they aren't. And there may be barriers to things like traveling for treatment and things as a result of that. Sexual and reproductive health is also impacted, including through menstrual dysfunction, as Catherine's just said, and cognitive and functional difficulties may make family planning really difficult, as well as impacting the existing family. Women also have really gendered social vulnerability to actually sustaining a TBI and having a poorer recovery outcome.
Domestic violence and brain injury is very connected. Rather than sort of reading through these slides, I'll just say we have a domestic violence TBI task force. We'd love for you to join and have monthly calls, but that depending on the research, 51 to up to 90% of women have TBIs during domestic violence, including strangulation and hypoxia.
A really vulnerable group is incarcerated women. So these are women who've been separated from their families and are often in and out of prison for shorter sentences. And these statistics show that they have really high rates of TBI. So for example, this study in some Scottish prisons found 78% of women had experienced a head injury, 40% had ongoing associated functional problems or ongoing disability, and 89% of the women who'd sustained repeated head injuries got those injuries as a result of intimate partner violence. Another study by the Disabilities Trust found really similar results. They looked at women in HMP Drake Hall in the UK. They found 96% were survivors of IPV, of intimate partner violence, and 64% had experienced a TBI, and 62% of those TBIs resulted from intimate partner violence. So this is a really vulnerable population of women who need rehabilitation and support. Going beyond the statistics as well, like these are real women who have real experiences of brain injury that impact them in prison, including having memory difficulties that can lead to sanctions or punishments if they don't do what they're supposed to do. Impact them on release, and their mental health outcomes as well are really quite severe. The Disabilities Trust introduced this brilliant link worker service, which was really successful, working with brain injury support staff, but projects like that need long-term funding. There's also racial inequity that's important to talk about. Like Black women, for example, are underrepresented in biomedical research data sets, underrepresented in clinical trials across medicine, even for conditions that disproportionately affect non-white people. And Black people with TBI specifically are less likely to receive the highest care quality, less likely to be discharged to rehabilitation centres, and have poorer recovery trajectories on the whole.
And very quickly, I'm just going to run through some research that we have done. We have 9 research papers out in publication. I'm very grateful because every single person on this donated their time to actually be a part of the research. Our first study was conducted in 2013 that showed that at the time people were saying that women reported their concussions more often than men, but we found 79% of males were at the time hiding their concussions in sport, but 70% of the women were. There were different reasons that they were doing that. Women didn't have access to medical care and men didn't want to let down their team. We redid some of those questions later on in 2017 with younger students, and we found that on the time it took students to return to school, that at 21 days out, 19% of women were still out and 8% of the men. And then in the sports, we found that 21 days out, 31% of the women were still out to 21% of the men. We also just really quickly looked at students who masked their symptoms or exaggerated their symptoms to perhaps game the system. And there's concern a lot of the time we find with teachers and administrations and coaches that they're magnifying the problem, the students are to not come back. And we actually found that the students were minimizing, 30% of the girls were minimizing their symptoms, not telling the nurse, the doctor, the athletic trainer, the physio to get back to school. We also found with the boys that 27%. So I think that masking is really interesting. And then we did another project where we looked at 11,000 students. If you look at larger numbers, female to male, there were more female concussions in this group from kindergarten to 12th grade, which is our grade right before uni. The younger children, the girls were 38% of the concussions. And then when they went to high school, they jumped to 62%. And we think that is related to the increase of women playing more competitive sports. But we found that the girls in the younger ages were 4 days took 4 days longer for their parents to take them to a doctor. And then they were also held out longer. We want to do really quickly talk about female representation in brain banks.
There's several reasons that brain donation is lower for females. Brain banks often recruit from male-orientated sports environments, or sign-up processes can be difficult, and lots of women just don't know that their brains are needed for research.
We have a Pink Brain Pledge where people, men and women, can sign up for brain injury, and we will connect them to their country. We have USA. We have in the UK, the Glasgow Brain Injury Research Group, Willie Stewart, and in Canada, Toronto General Hospital Brain Bank. I said before, Domestic Violence Task Force, love to have you join.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening to us. I apologise that we're a little bit over time, but we would love it if you reached out to us to carry on the conversations as well, so our email addresses are there.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. It was so much amazing data there, and lots of interesting things for us to think about. Unfortunately, we are running over slightly, so if it's okay, we'll move over to our final talk now, and then if people have questions, they can ask them at the end of all the talks in the discussion section. But yeah, thank you again very much. And we're going to move on to Katherine Hanlon. Shloka, would you like to introduce her?
Yeah, apologies for my internet cutting out in between before, but it is my absolute pleasure to be introducing our third speaker for today, who is Katherine Hanlon. She's a Research Impact and Strategy Officer at Alzheimer's Research UK, who's going to be talking to us about gender disparities in dementia research in the career pipeline. Over to you, Katherine.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, have you got the right view up there? Yeah, okay, great. I'll kick off then. So, yeah, I'm Katherine Hanlon and I work on the research team at Alzheimer's Research UK. And today I'm going to talk to you about the gender disparities in the dementia research pipeline. So firstly, I want to give an introduction to Alzheimer's Research UK, for those of you who don't know who we are. We're the largest UK charity funder of dementia research in the UK, and we fund biomedical research to help build our understanding of the causes of dementia and to improve diagnosis, prevention and treatment. As well as funding research, we also work to build awareness of dementia, and we have a policy team which works to ensure that dementia research is high on the UK government's agenda. So here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So the main bulk of my talk is going to be about women as researchers in the dementia research field, but I'm also going to touch on the impact that dementia has on women, and that's based on a report that our policy has undertaken. So I'm going to jump right in and talk about the work that we did on women in the dementia research field. So we've recently published a paper on this, and I'll share the details of where you can find that towards the end of the presentation. But the reason we wanted to do this work is that when we look at academia in general, we see that women make up a large proportion of researchers in academia. But when you look at more senior contracts and professorships, you see that there's a much smaller representation of women in these positions. So this underrepresentation at senior levels suggests that there are barriers in place which are affecting the career progression of women. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to see if we saw this pattern in the dementia research field specifically, and we also wanted to see if there's anything we could do as a funder to remove some of these barriers. So how do we do this? So we carried out analysis looking at gender discrepancies using 3 sources of data. The first was conference data, so conference attendance data. We use this to try and work out the gender breakdown of the dementia research field as a whole. We then looked at bibliometric analysis of publications, so who was publishing, how often they were publishing. And then finally, we looked at our own grant funding data. So this was to see what proportion of grants were awarded to women, and then whether this was affected by the type of grant they were applying to. So I just want to add here that our analysis used a computer program to infer gender based on researcher names. So we know that this is a binary approach that's not going to reflect the reality of gender identification. And ideally, we'd want the researchers to be able to self-identify. But unfortunately, this was not possible with the data that we had access to. But going forward, Alzheimer's Research UK now ask our grant applicants to provide us with their gender identity, so then we can carry out more accurate analysis in the future. Okay, so moving on to what we found. When we looked at conference attendance data, we found that women make up the majority of the dementia research field today. So when we looked at who was attending the conferences, we found that between 50 and 65% of attendees were women. And we also found that there was a higher proportion of women attending conferences when they were hybrid or offered online. So we think that the shift to online conferences has allowed a broader selection of audiences to attend these events. So this now more accurately represents the field. So given that we're seeing a high representation of women in the dementia research field, we want to see if this was spread across different career stages. So what we did next was we looked at publications. And we looked at publications from the last 20 years, and we saw that on average, men publish more than women, with men publishing 4.2 papers on average, while women publish 3.1 papers on average. So on the positive side, it does look like this gender gap in publications is closing, which you can see on this graph. I'll just pull up the point. So what we did is we wanted to look at not only how many publications men and women were releasing, but also what position they held on this publication. So we looked at first and last authorships. And this is because first authorships tend to be held by early career researchers, whereas last authorships tend to be held by more senior researchers. And these also tend to be the people who hold the grant money for the research. So what you can see on the left is for first authorships, women are this purple line, and we see an increase over the past 20 years. We're hitting a 50-50 split in 2018, and this has continued to rise. So this is slightly more representative of the number of women in the field. But when we look at last authorships, the increase, there's still an increase, but it's much slower. And we're still seeing that the majority of last author publications are held by men. So this just highlights that there are fewer women progressing to more senior positions in dementia research. So then the next metric we looked at was grant funding. And we looked at our own internal funding data from the past 20 years. And we found that there was a strong association between applicant gender and the type of grant that they applied to. So we looked at two of our different grant schemes. We looked at fellowships and major projects. So our fellowships are aimed at early career researchers who tend to be a couple of years after completing their PhD, whereas major projects are larger grant schemes, and these are applied to by senior investigators. So what we found was that for fellowships, the majority of applications came from women, with 59% of applicants being women. But for the major projects, 65% of applications came from men. So that's the majority of applications coming from men. So this again corroborates what we saw with publication data, that while the field is largely female, we're seeing this representation is not moving up to more senior positions. So this graph just shows similar. This is also funding data, but this is who is receiving the funding. So it's showing the success rates of the different schemes. So again, for the fellowships, which are the early career researcher schemes, the women have a higher success rate than men. But when we look at major projects and other senior projects, men have higher success rates. So again, this is just showing that the women are not really progressing to these senior positions. So what we wanted to do next is kind of ask why we're seeing this difference in success rate between men and women. So we wanted to see whether maybe the gender of the reviewer and the applicant had a relationship that was affecting the scores. So this graph just shows the distribution of scores given by external peer reviewers for our major project grant applications. And our external reviewers, what we asked them to do is give applications a score between 1 and 5. 1's the best score and 5 is the worst score. So as you can see in this graph, this is a breakdown of different gender relationships. So up here we have women reviewing women, then we have women reviewing men, men reviewing women, and men reviewing men. And what we saw is that men reviewing men give out the highest proportion of 1s as scores, so that's the best score. But women reviewing women give out the lowest proportion of 1s, so only 19%. So what we see when we look at this data altogether is that women reviewers tend to give harsher scores, but also that women as applicants receive worse scores than men from both male and female reviewers. So what we're seeing here is there's some bias in the review process based on gender. So just to summarise the findings from our analysis, we found that women make up the majority of the dementia research field today, and that women publish fewer papers on average and hold fewer senior positions than men. We also saw that applicant gender plays a role in the application and success rate of our grant schemes, and that grant scoring is affected by the gender of the reviewer. So when we look at this all together, our results paint the picture that women in the dementia research field face additional barriers to career progression that are not faced by men. So we discussed some of the reasons behind this in more detail in the paper, but now I want to move on to what we're going to do about this. So as a research funder, Alzheimer's Research UK wanted to use these findings to improve how we fund research and to make sure our funding processes are fair and that we're funding the best science irrespective of gender. So we've implemented some changes at each of these stages of our funding processes. So the first change we've made is to the application process, and this is that we're going to trial the use of narrative CVs. So the reason behind narrative CVs is that we want to address the use of publication number and number of grants received as markers of success, because as we've seen in our analysis, these markers can be biased. So instead, narrative CVs will allow applicants to describe their contributions to research using outputs of their choosing. And the idea is that this format will recognise an individual's varied research outputs and contributions to the wider research community. So the next change we're making is to our review processes. So firstly, we're going to implement more defined evaluation criteria for our external reviewers. And this is to try and address the bias that we're seeing in the review process based on gender. So it's possible that having a broader evaluation criteria can lead to reviewers applying their own criteria that could be influenced by personal biases, whether these are conscious or unconscious. So we've now implemented a more detailed guidelines for reviewers when they're assessing our applications. And the guidelines try to prompt the reviewers to consider firstly the science of the proposal, but also the applicant's wider contribution to the field. And again, we're trying to remove the over-reliance on publications and grant funding. So another change that we've made is that we're piloting blinding our applications. So we're going to use double blinding, which is where both the reviewer and the applicant do not know each other's identity. So again, we want to trial this to try and address some of the underlying biases in the peer review process. We're going to start off by trialing this on one of our senior research grants, and then we're going to roll this out to our other grant schemes based on the results of this. Then we're also making changes to the way we monitor the impact of our funding. So previously, Alzheimer's Research UK used a system called ResearchFish to capture the outputs from the research that we've funded. But we've moved away from this so that we're able to focus on research outputs that are more important to us. So our new progress reporting system is much more narrative, and it focuses on aspects such as knowledge generation, community building, and personal and career development. And then finally, we're trying to offer more support to early career researchers. And the aim of this is to try and retain women in the dementia research field. So we've implemented a new early career researcher program, which offers mentoring and training opportunities. And the focus is to try and help researchers who face additional barriers in the early stage of their careers and help them make the transition into more senior positions. So all of these changes together, we hope that they'll help support women in dementia research and address some of the discrepancies that we see in the career pipelines of women. But we do know this won't solve the problem and that it's just the start of a process. So we're going to continue to evaluate and make improvements to the way that we review and fund research. So just with the final few minutes of my talk, I'm just going to touch on a report on the impact of dementia on women. So this was undertaken by our policy team. And the reason they did this was they're trying to identify populations who are underrepresented in dementia research or are more impacted by dementia. And so they've produced this report, which sets out several areas in life where women are disproportionately affected by dementia. I'm going to share some of the findings and recommendations from this report, but you can read it in full on the AOUK website. So the first finding from this report was that dementia has been the leading cause of death for women in the UK since 2011. So this was even the case during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we found that 2 in 3 people with dementia are women, and that longer life expectancy of women alone does not explain this discrepancy. So there are a number of risk factors for dementia, which can affect women and men in different ways. But we need more research into these risk factors to understand how they're affecting dementia risk. We also found that women receive worse healthcare than men. So in the context of dementia, you can see this in diagnosis of dementia, because women are more likely to have a misdiagnosis or not be diagnosed with dementia, because early signs of dementia can present differently in women compared to men, and this is not always accounted for in diagnostic tests. We also saw that women are less likely to be included in clinical trials, which is particularly worrying when we consider that women have a 1.5 times higher risk of experiencing negative drug side effects from drug treatments. So not being included in clinical trials means that we have less of an understanding of how dementia treatments might affect women. We also see this in animal models as well. So male animal models outnumber female models by 5 to 1. And then the final finding from this report was that women are more likely to become unpaid carers for people with dementia. And around 2/3 of unpaid carers of people with dementia are women. So this just shows that the impact of dementia on women is far-reaching and extends outside their own risk of developing the disease. So based on these findings, Alzheimer's Research UK are calling for action to tackle the disproportionate impact that dementia has on women. So here's a summary of the recommendations that we're making. These are aimed at the UK government as well as funders and regulators. There's a full description of these recommendations in the report, but I'll just share the top lines for now. So that's the end of my talk. I just want to finish by directing you to the 2 places where you can find more information of what I've discussed today. So as I say, the publication looking at the dementia research career pipeline can be found on the AMRC Open Research platform. And then our report on the impact of dementia on women can be found on our website. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Katherine. That was an amazing talk. Really, really enjoyed that. So much amazing data there to validate the experiences that researchers are having in the dementia field. And also the disproportionate effect of dementia on women is really interesting. And of course, it's great to see AR UK are making changes based on these things. So I'd like to ask one question on behalf of Women in Neuroscience UK, and we'd like to hear, I guess, the basics of why you think there are barriers to women, especially in entering the senior positions, and what's causing these effects that you're seeing.
Yeah, that's a very important question to ask. I think there are a lot of reasons for these barriers. One of the kind of more obvious reasons would be maternity leave and the motherhood penalty that researchers sometimes face. So that can have like long-term effects on our researchers' careers, but we found that that's not the only factor that's affecting these differences we're seeing in progression of women in research. So there's, as I touched on in my talk, there's lots of underlying biases in the review process, and things, it's kind of a cycle. You know, if there's fewer women publishing, then that might impact whether they receive grant funding or not, and then that can have a knock-on effect to their career. So I think what we're trying to do is break this cycle and change how we review, you know, what is a productive researcher and what outputs they're putting out there. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're going to take one question from the audience, and that's by Lan. Thank you, Lan, for your question. It asks, do you think that females are more scientifically critical or more careful or prudent in reviewing grant applications than males? If so, it would be a compliment for women.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's difficult to assess that. When we looked at the differences specifically on the same grant between men and women, obviously it's not such a large data set, so we couldn't see as sharp differences. But we have seen that there's difference in the kind of language that men and women use. So when men are talking about their research, they tend to be a bit more, you know, they kind of big it up, whereas women can kind of be more just telling it straight as it is. But no, I don't have any information on whether are more scientifically critical or prudent, but it is interesting that we're seeing this difference, that gender is having an impact on the scores given by reviewers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thanks for the additional questions as well. Hopefully we'll get a bit of time to discuss them more. But we're going to move on now to our group panel discussion with all of the speakers. So whilst we're looking through the chat, feel free to add any questions that's directed to all of the speakers in the chat or focused on their specific talks. But while you're doing that, I'll kick off with a broad question for each of our speakers. So we'd love to hear more about why you decided to become a researcher in the field that you're in, and maybe if you could give a shout out to any women that have helped you along the way. So I'll kick off with Victoria.
I love that question. So I went during my undergraduate, I worked on a clinical placement where I worked with an autistic girl, and she had difficulty getting a diagnosis and also having appropriate support put in place for her during her school and sort of in day-to-day life as well. So I think working with her sort of sparked that interest in autism. And then during my master's year, I started at King's College London, and I discovered that Professor Francesca Happe, who is an autism researcher, was working there. So I approached her and asked if I could get involved in any research, and she was doing a project about sex differences in autism as well there. So yeah, my career just carried on from working with Professor Francesca Happe and also Dr. Emma Colbert as well, who is an autism researcher. And then I think, yeah, just continued being passionate about it based on the stories I've heard from all of the participants I've worked with. And yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question, but
no, that's amazing. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And then moving on to Katherine Snedaker. Do you want to go next?
Hi, as one of the older people on the panel, at 1986, while I was in the pre-med track and knew at the time I was dyslexic, struggling a bit, and my advisor said that I was a woman, I'd really never amount to much. I'd probably been a lab tech, and so that I should really drop pre-med and try something a little easier for me. I ended up in the long term becoming a social worker, but I've always kind of been fascinated in the medical field. Sorry, the sun is rising here. But it's so many women. Odette Harris, who is the highest ranking African-American and highest ranking woman neuroscientist, neurosurgeon out in at Stanford University, was one of the first people who took my phone call about her study with brain injury in soldiers that situated it between male and female. I just find that I have to, push out and reach out. And I think there've been a lot of men and women that have helped, but it certainly would have, I'm hoping that those sexist views are way in the past and that women can, as I see so many women now in the field. So I'm just excited by seeing all the young female faces.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. That's great. And Hope, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a really great question. I think academically, I have to thank my supervisor, Hugh Williams, who is not a woman, but has always been really passionate about brain injury in the justice system. And he's a really brilliant advocate and really understands how these issues affect women. And he's always encouraged me and given me space to explore sex and gender differences in brain injury. In my research, he was my undergraduate supervisor, my master's supervisor, my PhD supervisor. So he's really worked with me all the way through my career.
And connected you and me.
Yeah, he did. He was responsible for connecting me with Katherine, who's my next person that I would definitely say has had an impact on me. And Katherine is really an amazing advocate and gives me so many opportunities to develop my own thoughts about these issues and speak and be involved in PINK Concussions in any way I can. And then I think finally as well, Dr. Monique Papadis is a mentor that I have through a science mentoring scheme. She is this incredible brain injury researcher. And yeah, she is just so generous with her time and her mentoring and her support, and is also involved in PINK Concussions and gives lots of brilliant talks about racial inequity and gender inequity in the healthcare world.
That's amazing to hear, and it's so great to highlight men and other genders as well that are helping us along the way as well and being allies. Fantastic. And we'll finish the question off with our other Katherine Hanlon.
Yeah, well, I think I again have to just give a massive shout out to the people I work with. So my colleagues at ARUK. I think it's been really great to see how passionate the research team has been on making changes and improvements and kind of assessing where we are and if we're maybe not serving certain groups as well as we should be. So that's been really great. I also want to give a shout out to Jorge because he did this work on the paper looking at the gender disparities. So that's been really great. And then the policy team as well for all the work they've done, trying to, push the agenda of women in dementia and make sure that, it's heard. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I love following Jorge on Twitter. I haven't met him in person yet, but just everything he puts on Twitter, I'm like, yes, love this. Fantastic. So I'll pass over to Shloka to take some questions.
Yeah, so there's just one question in the chat regarding, I think, Katherine's talk, and then we overran, so we didn't have the time for that. So thank you, Hope, for your question. She asks, will you run an ongoing evaluation of how successful the modifications you're making will be? Would be great to see other organizations following in your footsteps if you could find that the modifications and the applications processes are successful.
Oops, sorry, I was confused over Katherine's. Yeah, that's a great question. We absolutely are going to continue evaluating these changes, especially because a lot of them are quite new to us. So we want to see what the impact of this is and make sure that it's making the difference that we want to see. So yeah, definitely we'll continue evaluating.
That's great to hear. So Irma, do you have another question for us? I see your camera's on. No problem at all.
No. Okay, thank you.
That's all right. If anybody else has questions, feel free to unmute and speak now or leave a question in the chat and we'll come to it as well.
I just wanted to throw out there this question of masking and camouflaging. And I'm wondering with ADHD, and I think it's an issue with brain injury, but that how often women have to mask to be successful or to hide abuse, the masking that goes on in domestic violence. I just think that Victoria's work super important.
Thank you. I think it's really important as well to think about it with other conditions and other experiences. And yeah, just why women are more expected to be. I think it's also, for example, in my work with autism and with other neurodivergences, and probably with brain injury as well, when we're thinking about interventions that are potentially aiming to help or give people skills or strategies that help them fit in or function in society, actually, we need to be careful not to encourage camouflaging or encourage masking or minimizing these difficulties that people are having as well. And I wonder if that's something that goes across to brain injury and things like that, making sure that we're not just encouraging masking and we're actually maybe adapting environments or adapting other people's opinions and things like that when thinking about interventions.
Thank you. I think there's another question in the chat. To Katherine S. and Hope, is there a difference in the support women need after concussion? Thank you, other Katherine, for your question.
I'll let Hope comment too, but my thought is initially it's the education. One of the things that I most talk about a lot is that women aren't given a long enough runway to land that plane. And if you think that runway is 7 to 10 days and you take 3 weeks, you already think you're wrong and bad, or people think you're malingering. So if we extend that runway and say it's 22 to 44 days, it gives women the time. So I think initially it's education about their bodies. Hope?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's differences as well that we touched on in the presentation with those more feminine roles that women are expected to fulfill traditionally, particularly with childcare and things like that, that they might need additional support with that isn't necessarily always the case for men sometimes. And I think there's also like gender differences in what women need coming out of abusive relationships. So sometimes a brain injury can impact on their experience in the courtroom. They might have their ability to be a good mother questioned and things if it's recorded that they have a disability, and they might panic about their children being taken away from them and given back to their partner who they're trying to leave. And there's like whole experiences there that are really gendered and that women do need specific support for, but all of that comes from understanding and from judges having the understanding that a brain injury does not equate to being a bad mother, and from lawyers having understandings of how brain injuries might have an impact, but also how women can be supported to work through those, and of domestic violence shelters having an understanding of screening women when they're coming into the shelters and how that might impact their behaviour and what modifications we can make to create successful rehabilitation experiences for those women. So yeah, there's loads of stuff in loads of different scenarios that I think women need additional support with. Yeah.
Thank you. It's really great to acknowledge all of these things that we need to work on, and it's good to talk about them so we can all think about it. So we've got a bit more time for maybe one more question. If anybody wants to unmute and speak or leave something in the chat, I'll leave it up to you.
I just had one thought I was late diagnosed ADHD in my 40s, thinking that my symptoms were the effect of brain injury when they actually were ADHD because I had been missed. But the difference between masking for me and feeling confident in myself, when I'm masking, I'm afraid I'm going to be found out. And when I've pulled myself together and I have a system down, I feel confident. My thoughts.
I don't know if you want me to comment on that, but yeah, I think that's a common experience for lots of people, and it's quite a good good way to distinguish between. So my brain just like completely stopped working there. A good way to distinguish between what are camouflaging strategies and what is self-confidence in self. self-esteem as well, because I think they can be overlapping, but it's important to consider to tease them apart so we can consider the outcomes associated with it and the consequences of camouflaging as well.
Victoria, can I ask where your research is going next? Are you planning to do some postdoctoral work? Have you got more studies planned?
So I have got a lot of data that I want to work on. In terms of my personal, where I'm going next, I'm going to be training as a clinical psychologist. So I'm going into more of a clinical route, but I still want to be involved in the research side of it. So yeah, I still plan to continue doing work about sex differences and gender differences in autism, and particularly focusing on camouflaging as well.
How exciting, good luck.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
That's
we have a
awesome.
question in, sorry.
No, you go for it, Shloka.
So there's a question in chat from Laura. Laura, thank you for your question. Can I ask Katherine H whether she looked at any data differences between COVID and lockdown impacts on publishing and grant reviews?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So we didn't look super in depth into this, but we did see, you may have noticed on the graph that I presented that when we're looking at the publication rates for men and women, the last authorships, we saw a dip for women and an increase for men. So that kind of suggests that during the pandemic, there was, fewer women having these last author publications. So I think that's something that would be very interesting to look into as to what was going on during the pandemic. I don't know if there's possibly a link in what we see of maybe women having more caring responsibilities during this time. But yeah, we did see that. We didn't look at the grant review and if there's any difference in there, but that's definitely something that would be interesting to look at.
Absolutely, I agree. That's a really interesting topic and something that hopefully you can dissect a bit more with some research. So I think that's all we have time for today, really. I have a final question to pose to all of you before we finish up. So I'd like to ask, now we've talked about all of these issues and some of the movement in the right direction, I'd like to know what you think are the key differences you'd like to see in your various fields across maybe the next 10 years and how you think these might be achieved. So quite a big question, but if you have ideas for what you would like to see happen to improve these gender disparities and get more gender equity. I'll start with Victoria.
That's a big question. I think that I would like to see people of all genders getting a timely diagnosis and appropriate tailored support. Although I focused on sort of female or the experience of women and girls today, I think that similar experiences can be for people for all different genders, and that needs to be understood more. And in terms of how we achieve that, I think it's really about improving the understanding of different people involved across the diagnostic process, but also those who might recognize autistic traits as well. So improving training and creating, I guess, more inclusive environments so that people don't feel the need to camouflage in those situations as well, and they can feel like they can be their true selves and get support for any challenges that they have as well.
I love that. That was a great summary. Thank you. I'll move on to our brain injury researchers, Hope and Katherine. Do you have anything you'd like to see, especially in your field?
Hope, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do. I feel like I have 1,000 things I'd like to see. I think really importantly representation, so of women in brain banks in big biomedical data sets, and then also that applies to marginalized groups of women as well, Black women, women from traveller communities, Indigenous women in America. I think they really need to be represented and centred in the research as well. So research that actually aims to examine gender differences rather than tacking it on as a footnote at the end of something that's confounding the results would be great. And then I think generally funding, so particularly my work in the justice system, we need long-term funding for support workers rather than short-term projects that introduce something great and then have to take it away again when the funding ends. So just more resource. Katherine, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Yeah, well said. Specifically important to me is to look at, in the United States, the systemic racism that we have in our medical field and the access to care for all people of color, indigenous communities, the lack of medical care, when you enter care, the systemic racism that is built in, and it's really a problem in the brain injury field. And it was something in my own organization that I was blind to for many years. So from a standpoint of cultural humility, I'm really trying to turn our small corner of the world around. And then just more people asking questions like you all. And I do want to just ask, we have a YouTube channel that I interview researchers, men, women of color, how they became researchers in the brain injury field. And I think there's a lot of inspiring stories there if you're a young researcher or a young medical person starting out. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Katherine and Hope. That was great. It's really important to think about these intersections as well and not just gender alone. So moving on to Katherine Hanlon, do you have anything that you'd like to see in the dementia field?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I want to see the gap in academia closing, but also when we're talking about like the research itself, just more research into risk factors that are specific to women. And that's not just the dementia field, you know, any kind of disease, especially diseases where women have a higher risk of dying from these diseases. So I think that research is really important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So that's the end of our session. I'd like to thank my co-chair, Shloka, very much for helping me with all the Q&A sessions. She's been amazing. And of course, to all of the speakers, so both Katherine's, Hope and Victoria, you've been amazing and brought so much interesting data and thoughts for us to think about today. And of course, all of the attendees for coming along. There's so many of you and your questions have been fantastic. So we really appreciate that. And we'd like to invite you to complete our quick feedback form as well, if you're able to, just to let us know what you thought about our session. And this is really useful for us going forward to future events to know what's gone well and what we should include in the future. So that's it from us. Thank you very much for attending our session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you for this amazing panel. It was really complete and very fabulous. And really something, so many details. It was such a pleasure having you. And Professor Mardi, are you?
Thank you, Lizzie, for accepting our invitation. Thank you, Win UK, for the nice presentation. I hope see you again in our upcoming event. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us. Best of luck with the rest of the event.